It's day 500 of Russia's war in Ukraine. The battle lines have moved up and down in this period, but neither side has given up. As we speak, President Zelensky is on the road. He visited Bulgaria first, the Czech Republic second, and now he's heading to Turkey. All three countries are NATO members. This is Zelensky's first trip to Turkey since the invasion began. It promises to be a crucial one. Zelensky will be looking for two things in Istanbul. One is President Erdogan's support to join NATO. The Turkish president has become the Grinch of NATO expansion. He threatened to stall Finland. He is still stalling Sweden. So Zelensky wants to secure his support. And objective number two, extending the Black Sea grain deal. The United Nations had mediated this deal between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey played a key role in that. Under this deal, grain trade via the Black Sea resumed despite the war. But on the 17th of July, this month, the deal will expire. So Zelensky needs Erdogan's support to extend the deal. The hope is that Turkey can convince Russia. Now, you may have noticed that Zelensky is traveling a lot nowadays, a lot more. He even flew all the way to Washington, D.C. The question is why? Because war fatigue has set in. Zelensky needs more advanced weapons to take the fight to Russia, but for that, he needs Western support. He needs clear signals from NATO. That's what he demanded during his meetings in Prague. Some honesty from the alliance. Listen to this.
Some people will look back at Moscow. Some people are afraid of Russia. Although I believe that this is a great moment, a great chance to show the courage of the entire alliance and the strength of the alliance. But nevertheless, we are talking about a clear signal, some concrete things in the direction of an invitation. We need this motivation. We need honesty in our relations.
NATO leaders will be meeting in Lithuania next week. It's Finland's first summit. Zelensky could end up getting an invitation, but will his country get one? I'm talking about NATO membership. Ukraine has been fighting for 500 days for the right to join NATO, but the alliance has been non-committal. It says a country at war cannot be given membership, which is why Zelensky is on the road to drum up support for his cause. A lot depends on what the United States decides to do. Publicly, Joe Biden has been confident. He may have confused Ukraine for Iraq, but his statement was quite clear. Putin should lose, that's what he said. But behind the scenes, there have been some interesting developments. Some back-channel diplomacy. Look at these reports. They say former US officials have been holding secret talks with Russia. For what? To somehow try and end the war. Now, the details are sketchy, but here's what we know. The US was represented by former White House and State Department officials, and Russia by people close to the Kremlin. In one instance, even Sergei Lavrov represented Russia. The foreign minister met a group of former US officials in April, and what is the White House saying about this? They're using typical diplomatic language. We knew about it, but we did not clear it. In other words, we didn't start it, but we do not mind it either. Perhaps it's true, but let me tell you what Joe Biden has decided to approve: cluster bombs. The US is preparing a new package of weapons for Ukraine. For the first time, it will include cluster bombs. And this is a controversial weapon. Many countries, including the US, are phasing it out. The reason? It's too dangerous and unreliable. Cluster bombs contain hundreds of smaller bombs inside. They don't hit one target. They carpet bomb the whole place. So there are more chances of civilian casualties. Plus, most of them never go off. Around 10 to 40% of cluster bombs fail. But years or decades later, they may explode in civilian areas. Even today, cluster bombs from the 1960s explode in Vietnam and Laos. Now, Ukraine and Russia have both used cluster bombs. Kiev first got them from Turkey. But this is the first time that Washington, D.C. is providing them. And what does that mean? Is the U.S. desperate, or do they sense a window? Either way, it's not an encouraging sign. On Thursday, a Russian missile struck Ukraine's Lviv city. Around 10 people were killed. Yet neither side is any closer to their objectives. Ukraine has no guarantees from the NATO, and Russia is not any closer to Kiev. In fact, Zelensky is so confident, he's traveling almost every month. After 500 days, war has sort of become routine, something you wake up to and do every day. It's a dangerous phase in any conflict. Our next story is from Canada. What's happening there reminds me of an old proverb. You can wake up someone who's asleep, but you can't wake up someone who's pretending to sleep. Sums up their Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. His country has a major extremism problem. And where is it coming from? The Khalistanis. Many of these Indian separatists have settled in Canada. After all, what's not to like? Lots of jobs, good enough pay, and the license to peddle extremism. India has repeatedly asked Trudeau to crack down on Khalistanis, to round up those wanted in India or to cut off their funding. But every time, he's refused to do so. This week was no different. Justin Trudeau was asked a very specific question about Khalistanis. The reporter pointed out two instances. One was this controversial float. It shows the assassination of Indira Gandhi. The second was this poster. It's for a Khalistan freedom rally on Saturday. It says, "Kill India." Now, the question to Trudeau was quite simple. India is saying you're dragging your feet on terrorism. What is your response? Listen to his answer.
Canada has always taken extremely seriously violence and threats of violence. We've always taken serious action against terrorism, and we always will. We have an extremely diverse country, and freedom of expression is something that we have. But we will always make sure that we are pushing back against violence and extremism in all its forms.
He's way off the mark. Trudeau thinks this is about freedom of expression. Let's put that to the test. In March, a mob of Khalistanis attacked Indian Canadians in Surrey. At least 3 people were injured. The same month, India's High Commission was attacked. Reports say 2 grenades were thrown at the building. Last month, this float appeared in Brampton. It glorifies the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and tomorrow there will be a Khalistan freedom rally. The posters describe Indian diplomats as killers. These are all incidents in the last 3 months. I could give you more examples of temples vandalized, of Indian Canadians assaulted and threatened. How do these incidents count as freedom of expression? They're hate speech at best, terrorism at worst. The Indian External Affairs Ministry has responded to Trudeau's statement. It says the issue is not freedom of expression. Listen to this.
We have seen media reports about comments by Prime Minister Trudeau. The issue is not about freedom of expression, but its misuse for advocating violence, propagating separatism, and legitimizing terrorism.
So why is Trudeau not cracking down? Because he needs the Khalistani vote. Trudeau's party does not have outright majority in Canada's parliament. They are part of a coalition. Guess who else is part of that same coalition? Jagmeet Singh and the New Democratic Party. Now, Jagmeet Singh is a Khalistani sympathizer. He has supported the call for a Khalistani referendum. So the issue is not really freedom of expression. The issue is vote bank politics. Plus, it's not like Justin Trudeau hates cracking down. When it concerns him, Trudeau is more than willing. And I'll show you 2 instances. Last year, a man in Ontario was sentenced to 2 months of house arrest. His crime? He carried a poster that showed a hangman with Justin Trudeau. Another person was given 90 days of house arrest and 12 months of probation. And what did he do? He threw stones at Justin Trudeau's house. Now, we're not saying these are small crimes. We are saying Khalistanis are doing far worse. You're putting people in jail for posters that threaten Trudeau, but a float that glorifies an Indian leader's assassination is freedom of speech. You're arresting protesters who throw stones, but throwing grenades and storming high commissions is freedom of expression. This double standard will not serve Canada well. It's almost like a well-planned campaign. They're commenting on India's internal matters, they're accusing India of meddling in Canadian affairs, and they're also protecting and bolstering Khalistanis. So at what point does India say, enough is enough? Many would say years ago. Now to West Asia, where tensions are flaring in the Persian Gulf. It started on the 5th of July. That's when Iran tried to seize 2 oil tankers. And this is where it happened, in the Strait of Hormuz. We'll tell you more about the location later, but first a rundown of what happened. The first vessel was a Marshall Islands flagged oil tanker. It was going through the Strait of Hormuz, heading for the Arabian Sea. That's when an Iranian Navy vessel approached it. It's not clear why this Iranian vessel was there or why it tried to seize the tanker, but this continued until the US Navy intervened. The Iranians left only after a US Navy destroyer arrived. It was the USS McFall. Then 3 hours later, the second incident took place. This time, the target was a different oil tanker. It was called the Richmond Voyager. This tanker too was heading for the Arabian Sea. An Iranian ship approached it. The tanker issued a distress call. The same US Navy destroyer, USS McFall, received this call, so it set sail towards the area. But as the Americans got closer, the Iranians opened fire. They targeted the tanker. No one was injured. It hit the side of the ship. And as soon as the US Navy arrived, the Iranians backed off again. So these are two incidents where the US Navy intervened. It says it prevented Iran from capturing these oil tankers. And what does Iran say? It says it was operating on a court order, and that a court ordered them to seize the second tanker, the Richmond Voyager. Apparently, it had collided with an Iranian vessel, so the court told them to capture it. What about the first incident, though? No word on that. Which brings us to where all of this is happening, the Strait of Hormuz. Let's pull up the map for you. You see the Persian Gulf on one side and the Gulf of Oman on the other. In the middle is the Strait of Hormuz. It's the choke point between Iran and Oman, a 39-kilometer strait connecting the two. This is the world's most important oil passageway. 1/5 of all global oil shipments pass through the Strait of Hormuz. In 2019, it was 17.4 million barrels of oil per day. I'm sure it has gone up since then. So this strait is critical to oil trade. And Iran's actions will raise tensions here. Though this is not the first such instance. Such interceptions began in 2018 after the US walked out of the Iran nuclear deal. Tehran launched a series of attacks. The targets were the ships in these strategic Gulf waters. And why are they doing it again? You see, we're just a week away from the 8th anniversary of the Iran nuclear deal. Reports say Iran and the US are talking again, not directly, but through mediators. There are indications of progress too. Even reports about an interim deal. Both sides officially deny this, but both sides need the deal. Both Iran and America have elections next year. Iran has parliamentary polls. And the easing of sanctions will give the regime a boost. The US has a presidential election, and Biden needs to fulfill his promises, including the one on the Iran deal. And they've been hinting at compromises. Recently, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, said there was nothing wrong with a deal with the West. Then the Americans took a step back. They supported a transaction waiver. This allowed Iraq to transfer $2.7 billion of its debt to Iranian banks. So an interim deal could very much be in the works, in which case Iran's action in the Gulf of Oman could just be posturing, perhaps their way of trying to force America's hand. Our next story involves the Dutch government, and the British must watch it. The Dutch were among the first colonizers from Europe, and unlike the Brits, they're making amends. They're returning some 500 looted artifacts. These were looted from their former colonies, in this case, Indonesia and Sri Lanka. And these are priceless pieces of heritage. Some of them have been in Dutch possession for centuries. They were looted by soldiers and eventually made their way to museums. Finally, some of them are going home. And the key word here is some. Reports say that Dutch state, the state alone, possesses about 300,000 artifacts, 3 lakh. Right now, the country is returning just 484 of them. That's barely a drop in the ocean. A small step forward, long overdue, but forward nonetheless. So first, let's look at what's being returned. Indonesia will get back its so-called Lombok treasure. This includes precious stones, gold and silver jewelry. They were looted from a royal palace in the island of Lombok near Bali. Other objects include statues, a dagger, and even some modern art. These will be formally handed over to the Indonesian government on Monday. As for Sri Lanka, it's getting back just 6 objects, but one among them is quite explosive, pardon the pun. This is the cannon of Kandy. The ceremonial weapon is made of bronze, silver and gold inlaid with rubies. It was a gift for the king of Kandy in the 1740s, but the Dutch looted it around 1765. And then it made its way to the National Museum of the Netherlands in the year 1800. It's been on display there ever since. Now, after more than 2 centuries, the cannon will return to Sri Lanka. And you may be wondering, what brought this on? Why is the Netherlands suddenly giving back this loot? Well, the government is acting on the advice of an advisory committee. It released a report in the year 2020. It said all looted objects should be returned unconditionally. The report rightly called the Dutch colonial collections loot. It said the government should recognize the injustice and display willingness to make amends. Now, 3 years later, the Dutch government has started to act. Again, better late than never. And the Netherlands is not alone. A host of European nations have been coming to terms with their dark colonial past, like Germany, Belgium, and France. They've all started returning some looted artifacts. It began with French President Emmanuel Macron. In 2017, he called for the return of the loot, and since then, many have followed suit. But guess who hasn't? The UK. Britain is refusing to budge. They were the biggest looters. They have the greatest collection of colonial loot, and they don't want to give it up. Because if they do, they'll have to empty their legendary loot box. They call it the British Museum. They don't want to empty it. Not even the son of former colonial subjects, Rishi Sunak. He's the Prime Minister. A few months ago, Sunak said, and I'm quoting, "Our galleries and museums are funded by taxpayers because they are a huge asset to this country. We share their treasures with the world, and the world comes to the UK to see them. The collection of the British Museum is protected by law, and we have no plans to change it." So he's hiding behind the British Museum Act. It's a law that prevents the museum from returning any of its collections permanently. A rather convenient law made by the Brits to serve British interests. So while the rest of Europe sprouts a conscience, the UK still wants to brazen it out. We keep talking about de-dollarization. The name explains the concept. You take the dollar from the global economy. But what comes after that? Ideally, other currencies grow in stature. Like a multipolar world, it becomes a multi-currency market. The Indian rupee is trying to do that. It's a heavyweight in most of South Asia, but beyond that, the rupee doesn't have much influence. The Indian rupee makes up just 1.6% of global trade. There is a growing chorus to expand that. Last year, the State Bank of India made the first pitch. It said, it's time to internationalize the rupee. Now, a panel of the Reserve Bank of India has done the same. It has given recommendations on how to internationalize the rupee. So let's look at 3 important questions. When does a currency become international? How can the rupee achieve it? And what are the challenges? An international currency is like a popular teenager in school. You're in high demand. Consider the US dollar or the euro. Most countries use these currencies to trade. They also hold them in their reserves. So demand is key. When your currency has widespread demand, you can say it's international. Question number 2, how can the rupee achieve it? The RBI panel has suggested short-term and long-term policies. In the short term, the policy sounds quite simple. Use more rupees to trade. Maybe start with India's neighbors who already use the currency. Bhutan and Nepal use the rupee as a designated foreign currency. Sri Lanka did the same in 2022. So the idea is to use more rupees in regional trade. But the long-term solution is more complicated, like allowing Indian banks to open offshore branches, or harmonizing India's tax regimes, or using the RTGS for international transactions. You may have heard of it, RTGS. It transfers money from one account to another in real time. But one policy suggestion stands out, including the rupee in the special drawing rights basket, the SDR, special drawing rights. Quick side note, the SDR is the reserve held by the International Monetary Fund. It's like backup money. The SDR is a basket of 5 currencies, the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese yuan, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. Now, the suggestion is to include the Indian rupee in this basket, the SDR basket. Many experts say this will be a long process. It's not something which can be done overnight, which brings us to the final question. What are the challenges? There are 2 major ones. One is India's small export footprint. Like I said, you have to be like that popular kid in school. Other countries must be demanding you. And why would they do that? If they wanted to buy your goods or services. Let me show you an example, a list. China makes up 12% of all global exports. The US makes up 10%, Germany 7%, the UK 3.6%. Now look at India, just 2.4% of global exports. If there is no demand for Indian goods, countries will not use the rupee. Simple as that. But there is some good news too. India's exports are on a good trajectory. They were worth $375 billion in the year 2010, $375 billion. This year, they're expected to reach $770 billion, so exports have doubled. Challenge number 2 is convertibility. What does that mean? When you travel abroad, you may convert some rupees into dollars. That's convertibility. But there are different levels to it. Some currencies are fully convertible. In that case, the government won't interfere in your business. You can convert large sums of money into another currency as much as you want. Typically, these are developed economies. Now, there is no official list of fully convertible currencies, but these four appear on all the lists. The dollar, the euro, the pound, the yen. They are all fully convertible. Others, like the Indian rupee and the Chinese yuan, are partially convertible, meaning there are exchange limits. You can't just convert massive sums as you wish. The government sets a limit on how much you can convert. And then there are currencies that are non-convertible, like the North Korean won. Now, if you notice, the fully convertible ones are international currencies. And why is that? Because they are easier to buy and sell. Why would anyone use a currency that is hard to exchange? There is talk of making the Indian rupee fully convertible, but it's a tricky decision. The central bank cannot control a fully convertible currency. It's up to the market then. Right now in India, the RBI intervenes to keep the rupee stable. If it becomes fully convertible, you cannot do that. Another problem is volatility. Easier to convert also means easier to move. Foreign investors could pull out capital in the blink of an eye. Such shocks could affect the Indian market. So economists are asking India to be patient, to first build the requisites for a fully convertible currency, like a bigger export base, a higher per capita income, a more equitable wealth distribution, and more financial market maturity. Simply put, this is a developed economy's game. India is learning the ropes right now. Rest assured, the rupee's time will come. Now let's turn our attention to Japan. It is caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. Japan plans to release radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. It is treated, but it's radioactive nonetheless. And Japan wants to release more than 1 million tons of such water. For perspective, 1 million tons would fill some 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So that's a lot of water. It came from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. There was a tsunami more than a decade ago. It hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and since then, Japan has had this radioactive water. Now they're all set to release it, and the world is not thrilled about it. Japan's neighbors are complaining. They say it will harm the environment, but Japan insists the water is safe and that it's following international safety standards. We told you about this earlier this week. Tokyo has the go-ahead from the United Nations, from their watchdog on nuclear energy. It's called the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Listen to their head, Rafael Grossi.
The plan, as it has been proposed and devised, is in conformity with the agreed international standards. And its application, if the government decides to proceed with it, would have negligible impact on the environment, meaning the water, fish, and sediment.
This was 3 days ago. Now Grossi has spoken again, and he seems to be gaslighting his own green light in the most lukewarm of ways. He was asked if some of the international experts behind the report had concerns, and this was his reply.
I heard that being said. I'm not sure, to be honest, that is the case.
So now the UN watchdog is not sure if there were concerns. He says none of the experts raised concerns with him directly, but that he had heard of the issue. What does that mean? If experts disagree, should Japan be releasing the radioactive water at all? Also, on what grounds were the disagreements? If you dig deeper, you'll see the politics, and it's everywhere, politics. This team of experts that cleared Japan's plan had 11 members, and these were 11 members from different countries, including China. And China has been against Japan's plan from the word go.
Japan has not fully consulted with the international community, especially the relevant stakeholders. In July 2022, it again ignored strong opposition from the international community, officially approved plans for the water release. All these fully reflect their selfishness and arrogance.
Beijing has blasted the UN report. It says the watchdog should not be endorsing such a plan.
We do not endorse the plan or recommend this to be done. We say this plan is consistent with the standards. So I think the qualification is important because they often say this is one-sided. We do not take sides.
It seems like the UN is doing much more than just assessing radioactive water. It is stuck in the middle of a fight. Meanwhile, China has escalated the matter. It has announced a ban on Japanese food imports. Food from 10 states or prefectures in Japan will not be allowed in China. And this is bad news for Tokyo because China is the biggest buyer of Japanese seafood exports. This ban will hurt the country's economy. It will also directly affect the livelihood of its fishing communities. And while China is acting out, another neighbor is taking a step back. I'm talking about South Korea. Seoul was also a critic of the plan. Its people had started panic buying salt. They feared that sea salt would be contaminated once Japan releases the water, so they began hoarding. And prices shot up by almost 30% in the last 2 months. But now South Korea has backtracked. It has conducted its own assessment and it says Japan's water release is safe.
Based on a review of the treatment plan of contaminated water presented by Japan, we have confirmed the total concentration of radioactive materials meets standards for ocean discharge. Therefore, the plan meets international standards, including those of the IAEA.
Japan plans to release the water this summer. It says it is running out of tanks to store the water and space to build more tanks. It insists that the process is safe, but it will need more than a UN report to convince its people, its fishing communities, and some of its neighbors, the ones who maturely express concerns without throwing a tantrum. We haven't heard the last of this story. Speaking about conflicts, the US is trying to manage its relationship with China. The visit we've been telling you about is finally happening. US Treasury Chief Janet Yellen is finally in Beijing. She's on a 3-day trip. She received a low-key welcome at the airport, but the moment she stepped off the plane, a rainstorm brought some relief to a sweltering Beijing. But will this visit take the heat off US-China ties too? Well, from the looks of it, it may not. This will be a difficult visit. Yellen has 2 main objectives: manage tensions and improve ties. So she started by playing the good cop. She stressed on the importance of the relationship and said decoupling was impossible. Also, all Washington wanted was some healthy competition. Listen to this.
I've made clear that the United States does not seek a wholesale separation of our economies. We seek to diversify and not to decouple. A decoupling of the world's 2 largest economies would be destabilizing for the global economy, and it would be virtually impossible to undertake.
You heard her. Decoupling is virtually impossible, and she's right. These are 2 of the world's largest economies. Washington is Beijing's largest trading partner. China is among the top 2 holders of US debt. The Chinese market is crucial for American companies, so decoupling is a loss-loss proposition. Having said that, Yellen also criticized China. She said Beijing was not treating American companies well, obviously referring to the recent export curbs. On Monday, China curbed exports of 2 rare elements. These elements are used to make semiconductors, and the curbs did not come out of the blue. They were in response to America's actions. The Americans banned the sale of advanced chips to China. This is how Yellen justified it.
I also made clear that actions we take to protect our national security are designed to be narrowly targeted, and that they are premised on straightforward national security considerations. They're not undertaken to gain economic advantage over China.
And what did China say? I mentioned the weather before, and it looks like Beijing too was tracking it. Chinese Premier Li Qiang said the US-China ties are more than just rain and wind.
So yesterday when you arrived at our airport and got off the plane, a rainbow appeared in the sky. It is a natural phenomenon, of course, and it's something we often see. But I think it should also apply to the China-US relationship. I think there is more to China-US relations than just wind and rain. We will surely see more rainbows.
Well, rainbow or no rainbow, the export curbs were a timed message, a potential bargaining chip in this chip war. Reports say the US will hit back. It will restrict more chip sales to China. So then, what's the point of Yellen's visit? Why is she there at all? She is the 2nd top US official to visit China in the last 1 month. A few weeks back, it was US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He landed in Beijing and talked tough on Taiwan and Ukraine. He played the bad cop Then his president called Xi Jinping a dictator. And now they've sent Yellen to calm things down. Later this month, Biden's climate envoy, John Kerry, will also visit China. So there is an attempt to ease the icy relations, but it's not really helping. The ties are at an all-time low, the distrust is palpable, and the interests clash. Officials on both sides may talk about engagement and the need for a working relationship, but their policies do not reflect that. They've been playing a game of tit for tat. So Yellen's visit is mostly about keeping the line open and keeping the expectations realistic. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story, starting with dramatic CCTV footage from Argentina, where police acted quickly to rescue a woman from being shot by a man. In another South American nation, a volcano is making news. The Ubinas volcano in Peru reported a new explosion. And we also brought you visuals from Spain's San Fermin yesterday. Today, the festival kicked off its first bull run of the year. 4 people suffered injuries. Finally, what makes the 7th of July significant? Taking you back in history to the year 1985, 17-year-old German sensation Boris Becker became the youngest male player to win Wimbledon, a record which stands to this day. Becker's fast-paced serve and volley game earned him the nickname of Boom Boom. We're leaving you with these images. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on Monday.